So do you hear well, even those from the back? Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Okay.
All right.
I think so. We are going to start. Thank you for waiting this couple of minutes because we have here students from the undergraduate in games and multimedia, also from masters in digital games and digital games development. But I think I saw some new faces. I'm not sure if there are other programs present here. No, everyone is from digital games. And okay. So and they were in classes, so they are just leaving classes now because here it's now 5 p.m. and
Yes.
ending our day perfectly with your talk. So thank you once again very much for being available for this talk. I was very excited about this opportunity. I think that my students, everyone is also excited. So we have a big amphitheater. You cannot see everyone because the camera cannot capture them. And I didn't lock the chairs, so they are a bit spread around, but I tried to cover the center. So let's see if later for questions or something, you will be able to see them as well.
Yeah.
So I think that we can start when you are ready. Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay. Hi. I'm gonna set up the share here. Let me make this full screen. Oh, Zoom. Sorry. Multiple monitors. Give me 15 seconds. Share that. I hope that is sharing correctly. Okay,
Yes.
great. Oh, you know what? It didn't ask me to share sound again. They moved this button. Sorry. There. Great. This, yes. Okay. Hi, I'm Ben Burbank. I work at Valve Software. If you don't know who Valve is, that's okay. But we make a video game platform called Steam. We make a lot of video games like Half-Life and Counter-Strike, and Dota and I don't know, Deadlock now, and other things in the past, Portal, Left 4 Dead. I've been at Valve for about 7 years. But here, let's progress into this. But before I worked at Valve, I worked at a company called Campo Santo on a game called Firewatch, which was a dialogue-driven exploration game set in the woods. And before that, I worked at a company called Double Fine, where we made like sort of goofy story-based games. And then I also worked at EA for a long time. This is my 20th year in the games industry. Right now, if you ever need to reach me, my email address is there. Oh, it still has a Mastodon link here. I think I've moved to Blue Sky exclusively at this point. I don't know. The internet got weird in the last 5 years. But that's who I am. Largely, I work on gameplay systems here at Valve, which is, what does a player do? What does an NPC do? What makes a spark happen when a guy flips a lever in a map? But that also it can include like complex game systems, like how does water behave, or how does a physics system work when gravity rules change, and things like that. In the past, I've worked as a systems engineer at EA, especially. I worked on like multiplayer networking code and low-level rendering. And yeah, mostly I've worked on storytelling systems since then, which I'll describe in detail in this talk. So this talk, it's mostly going to be about games where characters speak like humans. So I know a lot of you are just sort of starting out in your game development journey, or maybe I'm making an assumption there, but just based on you're in school still. But these are the kind of games that I find really fascinating, and I've thought a lot about them, and so have the people I work with. This is going to be about story content reacting to player choice. So the player does something and something in the world reacts to it, and the tools that you would need in order to build that sort of content. This isn't necessarily going to include things like code examples, because that can get really dry and everyone forgets it if you do it in a talk anyway. And also, I'm not going to be judging specifically on writing quality, although I'll kind of hint at things that will make you seem smarter than you're writing maybe is. Um, Also, this has some videos in it. Some of the videos include swear words. I apologize if you are offended by American English swear words. I'm sorry. But let's talk about talking. So human speech has these sort of unwritten rules in it. They're not necessarily clear. There are a lot of pauses that people have that imply meaning. There is a lot of time space in between sentences, but also there's this concept of a rhythm for like if two people are talking to each other, there's an obvious point where you expect the person to reply, or there are all kinds of insane psychological games that we play as we speak. Most of it is like etiquette that you sort of learn as you grow and speak with other humans. I assume a robot trained speaker would not know these rules necessarily. And a lot of it is built on the fact that internally in our brains, we actually can't hear and speak at the same time. Like we can do it a little bit, but it's really, really challenging. Uh, so if you're ever like on a phone, it's very obvious. If two people try and speak at the same time while they're on the phone, they will have no idea what the other person said. Partly in the past, phones were a single transmission like audio source, so that wasn't even like electronically possible. But even if you were able to do it in a Zoom call or whatever, you just really can't keep up. Zoom in particular is particularly strange, where if people speak while someone is giving a talk or something or whatever, they don't necessarily hear it. There's all these awkward pauses that get built in that disrupt the normal pattern of human speech. But anyway, this is useful information, I promise. And then direct interruptions in a conversation are actually quite rare. Like they're pretty rude. So you'd be violating, those etiquette rules that you've learned. But sometimes something exciting can happen, or something can explode in the distance, and everyone in the room needs to react, or whatever. That's like those are sort of like expected interruptions. But generally, people talk until they think they are done. Humans have great short-term memory. We are able to remember things, well, unless there's something like psychologically wrong with a person, they are able to remember a thought that they had, and then they're able to branch off into another topic. They can return back to the previous topic, but if it's been 30 minutes, they'll forget what the heck they were talking about, or if it's even been 5 minutes. But if it's just been a little sidetrack, they will return to what they were speaking about. A concept being, so anyway, about this talk I'm giving right now, or about a job that we were discussing previously before we got interrupted. There are different types of dialogue lines that a character can give. So this is, in video game writing, there's a concept of barks, which are, the word comes from literal like dogs just shouting things. But in the case of a video game, that would be someone saying something like "There's a grenade on the ground," or "I spotted the bad guy," or frag out, enemy spotted, sort of Call of Duty lines. But then these can just be sort of overlaid on top of each other. They're basically sound effects. But they are useful, like barks are useful. They're not a form of conversation. They're still dialogue lines in that they are teaching the player, like, what is the NPC perceiving? What is the game world reacting to that I'm doing right now, or that it is doing right now? Like, we got to get the tank or something, and then the player knows, oh, there's a tank coming. But the conversations are the other sort of etiquette-based discussion thing I was talking about a minute ago. They are more nuanced. They especially like a reactive conversation, like one with a branching dialogue system, which I'll talk about more in depth. But generally, conversations are more like a movie, or like when you talk with your friends. But they can be fully scripted, so like they can be just like they just play out the way that a movie does, or they can be participatory, like the player can be walking around and interacting with the characters while they're happening. That said, when you're building like a conversation or any kind of dialogue in a video game, the easiest thing to like think about, if you know like object-oriented programming or any database or anything, you're going to start to want to break your dialogue down into lines. I mean, screenplays are written the way they are, where there's a speaker and then the thing they say, as opposed to the way that a novel is written, where it's, you know, sort of all one big soup of context. So a line is a single atomic unit of speech. I just said a line. I just said another one. They you would if you were putting these into some sort of database, you could give them some sort of unique identifier that's not necessarily the words that are in there, so that if you have a player intro to the machine line that's something like, hey, Gordon or whoever, hey, Gordon, here's a machine that does this teleportation thing I've been talking about. You could have that literal string be like a searchable identifier in there, but you could also just have a line ID on it that's something like player intro machine. And then later on, when you decide that that line is bad or that it needs to change, you can rewrite it without having to change all your game logic that's calling into that specific line. Yeah, they will be rewritten, they'll be rearranged, they'll be repurposed. If you work on any sort of video game with a lot of voice acting or just text, this stuff happens constantly. Like, it is just part of the iterative process of writing, because it's not, it's unlike a movie, which even those are written less and less linearly than they used to be. You don't know what all the words are going to be before you make the thing often. So at the end of like writing all this and breaking down your lines, you'll have this huge database of lines. And a database doesn't necessarily mean like a MySQL database or a whatever kind of flat file system. It doesn't really matter, but just some way to search for, hey, what was player machine intro? What was the text for it? Is there a WAV file that I need to play? That sort of information tends to get built up. And that can be built however your game engine or whatever needs it. So in a game like Firewatch, which is a 4-hour-long story-based game with kind of a lot of dialogue for a game of its size, we had 10,000 lines of dialogue that were recorded with voice actors. Ultimately, we recorded more like 20,000, but 10,000 end up in the final cut of the game. An average player probably hears 4,000 of the possible lines because there's a lot of things that you choose not to do or that are mutually exclusive. You can't necessarily do all of the things in the game. And so when we talk about those 10,000 lines in a big database and we start a sequence of speaking, it's never just line 1, then line 2, then line 3. It's never just play this, then say this, then say this. Tools for managing and sequencing dialogue lines have these sort of, a good tool will have a pre and post built-in like delay that you can tune. You don't have to necessarily make your WAV files longer or shorter, or your text strings have extra spaces at the end or whatever if there's no actual spoken dialogue. But you want these sort of delays built in. You want sort of controls for how the dialogue will play back in order to create the right dramatic effect and the right like reading speed or the right whatever on-screen performance. Then if the player can respond to speech, you need to cue their selection to create a seamless conversation. So an example of that would be, we talked about how things tend not to get interrupted when they're speaking because it's rude. If you make a player that is intentionally rude all the time, it can be funny, but also that's not normally how people speak. And then there are also going to be exceptions. So if you have if your character is experiencing something surprising, like I've mentioned before, maybe you do want that line to interrupt whatever was happening in the conversation. But generally, you're going to try and build these sequences that are, you know, with timings and animated reactions and whatever built in. And then there can be even external interruptions outside of the characters. So that's just sort of all built back in. Okay, so in a modern, like big AAA video game, you don't just get to type text and like record voice acting. Usually you also have to deal with animated characters. These pipelines can get insane. The video that I showed when I was testing the audio just a minute ago was from Senua's Sacrifice, which is now 8 years old, and at the time, like having a fully rigged like character wearing one of those hypervisors and all the motion dots to record every line of dialogue was a little absurd, but now that is sort of industry standard for um, on-screen characters. So if you're ever hiring actors for a thing, expect that you're going to have to pay them for that. That's a long time in the future, probably. But you'll also potentially be capturing their full body, and a lot of things will be interpreted from like those video feeds that I was mentioning, with those like camera mounts in front of their faces. This is like, don't try and build that tech anytime soon. It also changes very, very rapidly. Stuff like artificial intelligence pipelines are starting to replace some parts of this, not so much from a it's easier work standpoint, some of it is just what a machine does. When it sees a video, it has to produce like blend shapes and other things inside the game engine to know how the lips moved. And you could do that by hand, but I've worked with a lot of animators who've had to do that sort of work, and it sucks. It's fine for a machine to do it. It is extremely painful to try and like lip sync a video recording onto a 3D model, and computers are getting better at it. But anyway, that video I linked is here. I'll give these slides, out at the end of the talk or whenever. So you can watch that video later if you really want to see a modern pipeline in action. On top of that, there's localization to consider. So localization obviously branches out and gets more complicated the more data you need to translate. So if you only had like text, that's the easiest thing, but even just localizing text, like strings in different languages or different lengths. German, for example, is extremely verbose, whereas Asian languages sometimes read, right to left, or they can be extremely condensed, where kanji, for example, in Japanese can express the same paragraph in a few characters, whereas English would be more, German would be significantly more actual letters on screen. When we made Firewatch, we did end up shipping a voice localized version of it for Chinese. We had a partnership with a Chinese company that was helping us do this, but even with that, our case was sort of ideal. We didn't have on-screen characters whose mouths needed to match the animation. They just spoke over a radio to each other. And even with that, it was substantial work. If you needed to do the facial capturing or any sort of facial retargeting, that is effectively more work than it was to do in English to start with, because you're like dubbing on top of 3D characters. The Witcher 3, which is now 10 years old, had a really good process for this, which makes sense. They were Polish game developers who were shipping a game in English. And they definitely, thought about localization the whole time. Their tools were really good for it. I'm not going to show it because it's sort of a long little GDC talk here, but they had the ability to scale their animations based on the recorded dialogue line. So if, let's say, a German character who was speaking slowly, or when in English, if they were speaking at their average normal expected pace, then they put it into German and the sentence got much longer or slower or whatever. They would scale their character animations to sort of match, which sometimes produce like weird, like, I'm moving like this while talking animations, but for the most part, it was extremely seamless, and the localized customers had a very nice experience without having to go hand animate the entire like 90-hour video game again. Okay, that's sort of like an overview of like the data that goes into a conversation system, but let's talk about specific game examples. So the first ones I'm going to talk about are sports games. They are actually the simplest conversation system you can use. When I mentioned that I worked at EA when I first started in the games business, and one of the things I worked on was actually the dialogue system in like Madden, which is the NFL football game. But you wouldn't necessarily think that game has a useful conversation system, but it's very necessary because of the on-field commentary that the presentation personalities are giving. That's like part of what makes sports look like sports on TV. If you watch a FIFA game or anything like that, if you ever watch it without the audio, it doesn't feel like you're watching the same thing as if you have the sound on. And it's, mostly it's people explaining what is happening on the screen, because sometimes sports can be very confusing if you're just looking at it. But the system that you would use to make a reactive commentary system like that is very similar to what you would use when we made something like Firewatch. You're basically trying to simulate what the TV would be producing, like a TV broadcast. And when I worked at EA, like every year we would go to like actual sporting events and sit in the trailer with the producers who are sending the audio up to the live commentary people to like explain to them, here's what just happened. This guy went to this high school in this part of the US, and he has two brothers who are sports fans. Like they would always have all this extra information, but it's basically just a bunch of guys with binders and lots of data just feeding it onto the TV personalities over a headset. And that said, there's also all these other systems in the game. The in-game players are sometimes speaking with one another. There's coaches on the sidelines. There's the crowds having huge dynamic reactions to an event. Some sports are easier to achieve these near TV-like performances. So lots of games that have starts and stops tend to be easier to simulate than football, than soccer.
Chargers come up
here's an
first
example.
and 10 at their own 22. They'll run for the first time with Austin Eckler. And they're going to stop him right at the line of scrimmage. Just no cutback lane to be found whatsoever. 2nd and 10.
At the 22-yard
Looked like he was trying to bounce it outside, but no success.
Yeah, sometimes you got to just figure out where you're going to go, and sometimes you just have to take it to another spot. And trying to get it outside, the defensive pursuit was there and just ran him down.
Just past the 50, and he's taken down right at the 45-yard line.
Okay, so that was like a simple sporting event commentary moment. Here's like all the sort of things that it knew in order to make those little bits of conversation happen. The Chargers are playing at home, it's 1st and 10, et cetera, et cetera. They haven't run the ball yet this game, which is like a long-running fact that the game is keeping track of. On the previous play, they tried to run outside to the left, and the runner is stopped on the 22-yard line. Those are just hard facts. On the next play, the team catches it for a medium gain. The crowd reacts. You might have heard the cheering starting to occur. And the on-screen personality or the off-screen personalities are making commentary that relates to all those facts. Typically in sporting games, but in this rule kind of applies to most interesting writing. There are going to be 6 to 10 variables that determine what is effectively an interesting query. What is an interesting thing that I could talk about right now? You can always be like, oh, hey, it's good to see you again. Like the most generic sounding dialogue. But if you play a lot of, I don't know, games where dialogue is flat, or there's a huge open world where they're not necessarily keeping good track of what the player has been accomplishing, it can start to sound extremely robotic. Whereas if you have more variables, it can actually start to sound extremely reactive, which players like. Again, this isn't a hard rule. You can always have a single specific variable that is extremely important for any given piece of conversation, but you can also have extremely specific things, and I'll give some examples of what these sorts of queries look like. When you're talking, when a character is speaking, the most interesting thing that you can say at any given time is always the line that is the most specific to the data that you have. So, for example, if I knew the data that I, the player, am looking at a character named Dan, and that I, the player, am holding an apple, Dan might say, oh, I like apples. That's kind of interesting because he's reacting to what the player is doing. But if I'm looking at Dan, I'm holding an apple, and I have previously thrown an apple at Dan, which is a new fact that makes this line more specific. Dan might say with a little flinch, I used to like apples, which is kind of funny, but also is more interesting. Like, it's just fundamentally, there's more data. There's more player reactive response inside the game. It's just interesting. There are other sports games where this gets a little more interesting. I don't know how many of you know much about American baseball, but here, let's look at this for a second.
Now here's the pitch. Off-speed pitch, and there is strike 3 called. And boy, that zone just got a bit larger, 2 away.
Well, that call looked like it was a little in the pitcher's favor, but it wasn't outrageous. Hey, listen, calling balls and strikes is a really tough job, and even the best are going to miss some from time to time.
So in that example, no, stop playing. In that example, the on-screen commentators noticed that the game made a bad call. Like it intentionally, like it's a computer simulation. It knows that the ball wasn't in the strike zone of that player. It's a baseball rule. But if it goes outside of there, it shouldn't be called a strike. And everyone in the game, including the player on the base, gives sort of like a double take when the call happens. The off-screen commentators are making like notes like, oh, sometimes you make mistakes. And again, the computer simulation doesn't need to make a mistake. But if you've ever watched sports, you are always dealing, like every single sporting event, the commentator at some point makes a comment like this. So it's kind of cool that they put that into the game, that it's not just, the truth. That, I don't know, it makes it feel more human. I'm going to talk a little bit about some sort of simple conversation systems that are more interactive than a sporting event. So I worked on a game called Broken Age at Double Fine. It was a classic adventure game, sort of in the style of Monkey Island and Grim Fandango, which were games that people there had worked on in the 90s. The style of game had these loopable conversation trees. It was a fixed third-person perspective, so we were able to just compose shots like they were illustrated on a, in a normal Photoshop environment. And you had a very limited set of verbs. Like you could pick things up, you could show someone something, you could ask them a question. The characters had this sort of pick a line from a list of whatever is valid right now. Now, the way that these lists get populated is very similar to the stuff that I've discussed up to this point, where there are going to be built-in stuff that's like, hey, I talked to the people on the train, so there's going to show me the basic lines. But if I have, let's say, interacted with them previously, some of these lines may no longer be valid. Some of them may be loopable, which means I could ask them again, that sort of thing. It had voice acting, but it was, pre-baked animations. It was very simple. So I mentioned in that previous slide the concept of verbs, the kind of actions that a player can take. There are lots of things that a player can do that aren't just necessarily their attack types or their, the ability to jump or climb. An in-game event can be anything. And this is the sort of stuff that we like to keep track of when we are deciding what characters should talk about in a video game. So these things are often the result of a player performing some sort of verb, like pressing a button or jumping. But they can also be, you walked into a trigger volume, you got near an event, you saw something on screen. A character is near the middle of the screen, can sometimes be very useful in a first-person game. And they can even be like external things, like I don't know, there was the Mario 64 got ported to the Nintendo DS like 20 years ago, but it did a thing where if you ever put the game to sleep, Mario would say goodbye, and that is adorable that it was reacting to system events with audio. Anyway, with enough of these sorts of events, you can kind of keep track of what is the player, the user of your software, trying to do right now. which is incredibly hard to infer sometimes. Sometimes it's very easy. They're walking forward into a room. That's great. But if they're walking backwards into the same room, like that can also mean the same thing. It can also mean something completely different. So where they're looking isn't necessarily like a source of truth. So in the games that I've talked about so far, here's some example events. In an adventure game, you could use an object, you could select a dialogue response, you could gain an item. I've sort of mentioned those in a sports game. A turn or play has stopped. A rare but incredible thing occurred, like an interception, a penalty, or a bad call, or like time expired, or someone scored. Those sorts of things are, the kinds of events that are getting fed into a big like dialogue management system. Moving on to sort of what I consider more gold standard for modern Half-Life 2 is 20 years old this week, but more modern style video game responsiveness. At Valve, we use a system called response rules. These are big text files, sometimes with external tooling to help build them, but they're effectively like those queries I mentioned before. Things like I'm looking at Dan and I'm holding an apple. Play this line in that case. And they can be other sorts of responses as well. They don't have to necessarily be dialogue, but that's mostly what they are. Entities in the game have memory that they can, that you can ask for. So, for example, has the player ever jumped in front of this character who cares about jumping? Like that can be useful. That also means that they can sometimes not have superhuman knowledge. It's kind of interesting if an in-world character doesn't know that you stole a key from the jailer. Like that can be useful kind of fact for someone to have. Whereas if they saw it, it might be different. But this simple response rule system has allowed for incredibly reactive characters. It's generally been easy for our writers to work with, and not just writers, but anyone building game content. There's a huge talk about it at GDC. When we were making Firewatch, we watched this talk and re-implemented our own version of this system with different rules. But I like this concept of events. And here is the Portal 2 intro, which demonstrates response rules like pretty clearly.
Good morning. You have been in suspension for 50 days. In compliance with state and federal regulations, all testing candidates in the Aperture Science Extended Relaxation Center must be revived periodically for a mandatory physical and mental wellness exercise. You will hear a buzzer. When you hear the buzzer, look up at the ceiling. Good. You will hear a buzzer. When you hear the buzzer, look down at the floor. Good. This completes the gymnastic portion of your mandatory physical and mental wellness exercise. There is a framed painting on the wall. Please go stand in front of it. This is art. You will hear a buzzer. When you hear the buzzer, stare at the art. You should now feel mentally reinvigorated. If you suspect staring at art has not provided the required intellectual sustenance, reflect briefly on this classical music. Good. Now please return to your bed.
So Portal is a game that used response rules largely to help you solve puzzles, but also, to play jokes for the character. And in that sequence, we learned which way you like to tilt the analog stick on a controller in order to know which way you think up is. So I'm going to talk briefly about Firewatch. We had a generic event system that was sort of based on that Valve GDC talk that I discussed a minute ago, which it's basically an hour-long talk that explains that you can have different specific responses to things. We had a concept of what are called blackboards in our game, which are sort of just databases that characters know about. There could be local ones, which are specific to even like a light switch, but they can also be global, which would mean like what day is it, what time of day is it, that sort of thing. We had a huge focus on reactivity with our game, and we tried to never play a line twice. It was a first-person game where the player was able to initiate conversation from basically anywhere because you had a radio. You could call someone and ask, "Hey, what's this rock about? What's this thing about?" This was a game that we largely described as like a Metroid game, but the things that you kill are conversation topics, and you kill them by talking about them. We also gave a talk explaining how our dialogue system worked. But the rough gist of it is we wanted a reactive world. So here's an example early in Firewatch.
I'm staring at the big outcropping down here, but I'm not quite sure where to look for our pyrotechnicians.
Maybe keep heading west toward the lake.
Finding a bunch of empty beer cans. They threw them all over hell.
Are you fucking serious?
Yeah, sure am.
People are just the worst, aren't they?
They're not great, no. You know what? Fuck it. I'm not the maid. They left half a bottle of whiskey. Decent stuff.
Drunk pyromaniacs. Fucking great.
Oh, look. They decided to have a campfire, too.
You know, they color-coded the fire danger signs in case people were illiterate. But I guess that doesn't take into account just plain stupid, does it?
Found the fireworks. They didn't even try to hide them.
Well, confiscate them.
That probably could have ended poorly. How'd you get fired and wind up in jail all on your first day, Henry? I thought it'd be a good idea to chuck some Roman candles into a smoldering fire pit. A regular forest burns. Well, they left their clothes out to dry. It looks like 2 people. What if they're naked?
Won't that be exciting? Look, they're obviously still there, so tell them off and then head back.
I found a bra.
A nudie pyromaniac. Remain professional.
There are, panties.
There are what?
I don't want to say that word again.
Why, 'cause you're 12?
I found them in the lake.
Skinny dipping.
Yeah.
Is that a guy over there?
Oh boy. Enjoy dealing with that.
I know you guys are setting up bottle rockets out here, okay?
How? Because you're hiding in the bushes, spying on us? Give him a break, Lily. He probably hasn't seen boobs in 20 years. He's probably still a virgin. Why do guys think it's all right to just stare at girls? Oh, hey, put that down. Seriously, it was expensive.
Fucking cool it with the fireworks.
Please just put it down. We won't light anymore. This guy's creepy. You asshole!
Light another firework and it won't be your stereo I wreck.
Oh, fuck you, psycho. Yeah, fuck you.
So that was a sort of basic approach to that sequence. You could also do it very differently, and it would react appropriately.
Full stereo.
Oh, hey, put that down. Whoa, where are you going with that? My stereo. Who the hell are you? Can't you steal from us? You fucker.
Hey, that go okay?
I hope it drops.
Oh, wow. The music's a little loud.
Oh, sorry. I took their stereo.
Okay, well, I guess we're all even then?
Yeah, I think so.
But Seriously, though. Thanks for dealing with it.
And that is more like the Forest Rangers would actually behave. So here's some stuff we learned making a game like Firewatch. We often had places where we needed the character to walk from point A to point B. Sometimes that meant we had to completely change what they were talking about so that they couldn't just reach a place and just be waiting for people to finish talking. We wanted conversations to kind of fit naturally into the space that they were happening in. So I guess considering the fourth dimensional nature of conversation wasn't something I had ever had to work on before. Often our lines had multiple line readings, so you could have a character saying hello, or you could have them shouting hello, depending on if they were running or if they were walking. The Spider-Man games recently for PS5 have done this as well, and it's nice to see it showing up in bigger AAA games. And another thing that we learned was that if players get used to being able to do whatever they want, it can be hard to get them to do what the game wants. So if you've ever run a Dungeons and Dragons campaign, this is absolutely what it feels like when you start to give them a reactive world. They start to just go off the rails. That's true in most video games, but it was really true in a game where we tried to tell a human scale story. And then sometimes, as I mentioned, we had this sort of complicated, we had thousands of lines. We had a complicated series of queries to determine which line should be played. And sometimes those would sequence other things to happen and cause other events to happen, et cetera, et cetera. Being able to debug this was insanely useful. We had to build a pretty complicated visual debugger just to figure out, why did that thing just happen? So moving forward, after we made Firewatch, my company joined Valve. We helped make the video game Half-Life Alyx. We took some of those same learnings. In fact, there's a part even in the game where you have a radio and you're talking to some of the same voice actors from Firewatch because we liked working with them. But that game originally started as just a shooting gallery. Like they were just going to make a thing where you could play a little bit of Half-Life content. But over the years, it turned into more of a full story-based game. Around the time, not right around the time we joined, like several years into after we joined Valve, we were some of the people who helped completely recreate the story from scratch, given while still fitting inside the existing track, the existing maps that had been made. The Valve, the company was not happy with how the story was going, so we helped rewrite it. This is not the ideal way to write a story. Typically, you should have some idea what your story is going to be before you build all the content, but that's just how Half-Life games get built sometimes. And there's a huge documentary exploring how that game was made on Steam called The Final Hours of Half-Life Alyx. It's nice to look at. So, improving your story. Wrapping up about maybe 5 minutes left of the talk, and then we can get to questions. But if you're working on a video game, one of my favorite things you can learn is having a writer's room energy, learning how to sort of improv and yes and through an idea. Sometimes that can just be goofy jokes, but sometimes what the players if you're watching a playtest, what they're trying to do can sometimes really inform more of what your game should be. At both Campo and at Valve, we had, and at Double Fine, I guess, we had a writer's room approach, so that basically everybody would get in a room and watch playtests. We would all work on a new sequence together, and ideas can sort of come from anywhere. So you look at a scene, hey, there's fireworks on a thing. Well, what happens if the player throws fireworks onto the fire pit? Well, there should probably be a line of dialogue for that, because if there isn't one, it feels a bit unnatural. And if there is one, it starts to feel incredibly human. So, just coming up with those ideas is very helpful for creating a reactive world. But if you build a few of these sorts of events that are incredibly well thought out, where everything that a player could do has some sort of reaction, and you put those early in your video game, people will think the whole game does it that way. And they'll get exhausted if the whole game actually does do it that way. But they will start to think that your game is just doing magic tricks the whole time. I mentioned a minute ago playtesting. We at Valve, we extremely value it, and I found it very helpful throughout my career. But basically, you watch a player play, you try not to help them as much as possible. You let them get frustrated, so you find out where their pain points are in your game. But also, just ask some questions about the writing, like who were the characters? Like what were they trying to do? What were they talking about? Or what did they bring up any words or phrases that you remember? That stuff tends to, if you run a few play tests and people come up with the same thing, then clearly certain things are connecting with players more than others. Yeah, just tell me where the game took place, like describe it, because sometimes these details, maybe they're focusing on the thing that you weren't trying to show, but if it keeps coming up in playtest information, like if people who look at your thing keep saying, "Oh, I really like the posters on the wall in this room," maybe you should just put more posters on the walls because that's secretly what your game is about and you didn't know it. And yeah, where do you think they're going? So like understanding that a player knows what the character's motivations are is incredibly useful because otherwise probably your players are getting bored or confused. But outside of that, it can also help like identify which points in your writing are actually landing in people's brains, because we don't really pay attention to everything that someone says while we're playing a video game. And sometimes we remember things. And I've mentioned this before, but like empower writers, building tools for writers is very useful, but anyone can be a writer on a video game. It's like there are parts of it that are hard. Nailing perfect dialogue takes years of practice, but coming up with the ideas of what a character should say, sometimes anybody can do that, like an animator, an artist, whoever. Here's just some examples of some of the tools that I've talked about. Response rules at Valve. These are straight from Left 4 Dead. They are just big text files, and they are ostensibly human readable. Like you can actually look at this and kind of understand it once you know that things like what a VCD is. That's like a animated sequence. These criteria are sort of the things that I talked about where we're running queries in the code to look for. So you'll see like is not said coach coaches. I don't know what that specific fact is, but that's some Left 4 Dead thing. The Firewatch tool was incredibly rudimentary Unity like debug tool stuff, but it helped us make a really complicated reactive game. Ours was, like I said, we were trying to re-implement response rules. We didn't know that they were just text files because that wasn't clear watching the GDC talk. So we built like a little database thing on top of our game, but it does basically the same exact thing, except under the hood ours looks like a bunch of JSON garbage that a tool can output. When we were making a game called In the Valley of Gods, which was sort of our follow-up to Firewatch that has since been canceled, unfortunately, we had a much more graphical like display for these sorts of conversations, these sorts of things. We've taken those learnings into Valve in general, and we have tools that are more like this now at the company. But yeah, it was a good experiment. I mentioned The Witcher, like having cutscenes that scale. So they have these events they have these sequences of cutscenes. There are parts of it that are tagged up with being able to scale based on the dialogue or animation speed. That stuff tends to work really, really well. That's an incredibly complicated tool. Don't try and build that for a student project. You'll lose your mind, but it's good to think about in the future. That said, if you do want to try and build anything like this, there is unfortunately still no all-in-one solution that sort of does this for each game engine. So you're probably going to have to build some tools or write some code to hook something up. But for simple ideas, RenPy is still very good. It's a Python-based simple conversation like system for making visual novels. It can help teach you, how to make a conversation list, how to make an adventure game. Ink is a more complicated one. This company made a game called 80 Days some number of years ago. They open sourced it. They've got Unity exporters. I think they have Unreal exporters now for Ink content. It's an incredibly good thing. You can also just export it to like a web page and build a little dynamic story. It's a very good programming language. I like it a lot. Yarn was used in the game Night in the Woods a few years back. and a few other indie games have used it since. It's sort of very similar to all these other things I've talked about. Or you can build your own. It's a great learning exercise. Yeah, I don't know. And if you go and make tools like that, please come work with me someday because I can always use the help. That said, are there any questions for me about Valve or whatever?
Thank you.
Stop screen sharing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm just turning this on. So now for questions, I will ask you to speak loud, all right? And everyone keeps silent because the microphone is from here. So let's hope that Ben will hear well, all right? So first question, there.
So because Valve is actually known for like their open-ended design in games, where player behavior can actually feel fairly unpredictable, what are some of the challenges you face in creating interaction systems that allow for emergent player behavior and still maintain a coherent narrative experience?
So if I understand the question correctly, you're asking like, what are some of the challenges when building systems like this on top of an open-ended game? So does that sound right? Yeah. So a hard part of this is making sure that you don't put kind of too much into the game is sort of a weird part of it. In a game that you expect a player to play for 20 hours, if you fill the world with too much density, the players are going to get lost and start to expect it over the course of the 20 hours, and you're going to end up accidentally making a 40-hour game that's kind of boring because they will just not do the game. They'll go and look at every book and look at and talk to every character a dozen times. When they were making Half-Life 2, there is this section that takes place on a coast. Then you have a car and you drive around. And when they were first building it, they put a bunch of little like NPCs off in the distance that you could go drive up and talk to. And they had exactly the experience I just described, where they would put a character off in the distance, people would drive over and talk to them, and then the character would ask them to go do something, and then the player would go do it, and then they'd come back, and then over time, players just started trying to explore every single nook and cranny of this massive open space, and they had a bad experience. They instead decided to delete all of those things and just have the game be you drive to an interesting place, do an interesting combat thing, get back in your car and continue driving, which is like incredibly simplistic as a gameplay experience, but it was necessary because that part of the game was about getting from point A to point B, not about going and exploring new conversation systems. That's like one example. Another one is just sort of like idea generation is hard. Like if you let's say you have a more focused space, like a clear like that Firewatch lakeside area. You need to make sure that the game has enough content in it that the players can see that there's like a magic trick happening. So this is not a part where we care about the player moving from point A to point B. We want them to sort of hang out here for a little while and experience some story. But it took us a long time to get to the point where we were generating enough ideas that was interesting, and also had recorded all the dialogue and all the lines were good and all the and then on top of that, the like bug fixing matrix once we had a ton of content in there was nasty, where there are like 8 different things that can happen after you pick up that boombox, and if they happen at the wrong time, or if they happen because you did the wrong thing in the wrong order, because we had a logic bug, it can sometimes be very hard to notice that we've done that. I think those are sort of like the big ones. I mean, the other side of that is like, at some point you have to record voice actors. You have to, if it's a game where the characters are on screen, as I mentioned, you need to have animators go and like fix up any motion capture or any of that sort of like content starts to become a massive problem. I think those are sort of the major ones. I mean, that's sort of like just to fill a game with the decent stuff, which, you know, a company like Ubisoft is going to do just fine. But in order to like elevate it to the next level, you need to then like polish that stuff forever. And that starts to get expensive. I hope that answers some of that.
Yep. Thank you. Next question. Loud, please.
Hi, firstly, thank you so much for the presentation. So one day I really wanted to create a solo game, and I really like for it to be narrative driven. So my question was, what are the musts for like I'm turning on like that I should really implement in the game that I'm trying to create, and also what courses or people do you recommend for people like me to learn from?
Hmm. So, to start, so just so I understand, you're asking like, what are the sort of necessary things to implement for a narrative game made by a small or single person team? And then also, what are some like things you could go learn more from? Um, uh, Let me think. I'll answer the second part first because I think it's easier for me to answer that. I think you should watch movies and read books and like expand your interests beyond just what video games are capable of, because uh, good writing is good writing, and that will like help fill your brain with more interesting connections. Um, but that said, outside of like actual like technical learning, some of the talks that I linked here are actually quite good, I think, at doing this. If you have any access to a GDC vault, or if you just like go on their YouTube, those tend to be like they're, especially if you look for narrative, anything that's like has the word narrative in it or writing or they like tend to be really interesting talks because sometimes they're just about the writing, which is interesting. That'll help improve your writing quality, but often they will also discuss the specific like tools that they needed to make, or like if they were building an Excel spreadsheet of all the dialogue in a video game, how did they organize it? Like learning that sort of stuff can really help inspire you to build your own stuff. Um, uh, I'm trying to think of any specific, like I don't know, like the new Indiana Jones game that just came out has really good writing in it. I don't like that. I think go watch a stream of that or play it or whatever. But I think that like every now and then you'll see a game that does well. And then sometimes you'll see a game that's like, oh, that game has really good writing, like Baldur's Gate 3, which took like 10 years to make and had, I don't know, hundreds of people working on it. You can't really learn much from that because you can learn the fundamentals of like, wow, this is cool that they built a reactive world where I can be a bard that sings a song that makes people care about like dot 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 infinite possibilities. And they did that with hard work and time, which certainly on a student or solo game you're not going to have the advantage of. Um, uh, that said, um, uh, I don't know, like that game I mentioned a minute ago, Night in the Woods, I think is a really good example of a smaller team's game that has just interesting writing and it doesn't have voice acting. It has the simplest version of storytelling you can have where characters can talk to you, they can tell you interesting jokes. The art style is pretty like simplistic and easy to I'm not saying copy, but like you can build something that's like that, and there aren't enough games that are like that. Um, and that said, like going back to the sort of first part, what is the like stuff that you need to build? I mean, the real answer is always cut down to the bare minimum of what you think your product is. So there's the joke of like a person wants to make video games because they think they can make a perfect MMO RPG with all the shooting mechanics of a Call of Duty game, and they want it to be something you replay forever with auto-generated stories. All of these things are insane amounts of effort that you'll never end up building. The thing that like would be like fascinating would be Tetris with a story. Like I'm like that's the smallest possible thing I can sort of think of, or like what is the story of a Pac-Man game? Because like sometimes that can lead you to generating new and interesting ideas. Like Balatro is a great example that just came out. It doesn't really have writing in it, but it kind of does. But it's like the simplest ass game. It's just poker cards counting up numbers, and it's probably going to win Game of the Year at the Game Awards tonight. So, like, I don't know. I can't say that anything should be smaller than that. Uh, yeah. As for things that you should build, like, if you want your game to have a story, it should have a nice, pleasant way to interact with characters. Whatever that is, I don't, that can just be simple speech bubbles, but, um, yeah. I don't know. There's not a great answer for that. Just always cut down.
Okay. Yep. Thank you. More questions? Yes.
First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. I just want to ask you something, one of other curiosity than everything. Like the past few years, like Valve changed from Source 1 to Source 2, and we saw like a big graphical improvement in the games. But I want to ask you, like, in this responsiveness, and if there was a big evolution in this field too, the past couple of years.
I would say there. So, yeah, we have not at this moment released a game that, and that I don't really see it out there for a game that has the levels of responsiveness that I would love to see. I don't know if there's a better way to word that. I was actually, I mentioned it a minute ago, but that Indiana Jones game that just came out is actually the closest thing to like a Firewatch level of interaction that I've seen in a AAA game, and that's like Firewatch is 9 years old at this point, so I'm happy to see it's influencing people, I guess. But that game, you know, you can pick up a shovel and hit someone with it, and every now and then Indiana Jones will say some stupid one-liner about hitting someone with a shovel, and you, the player, like, this is, I'm experiencing a magic trick right now. That's incredible. Like I would say that things like Minecraft have created a sort of different vector for responsiveness, where creativity, like player creativity at the ultimate like apex, is sort of where we're at, where you are kind of limited at this point by, in a game like that, where the player is able to make anything they want, anything they can imagine. They can sort of happen within the graphical fidelity of a Minecraft game, and that's interesting. But ultimately, like, I can also just write a story on my computer. I can open up Unity and make an indie game. I don't necessarily need to do this in Minecraft. And I worry about that level of like creative expression being an eventual dead end. Similarly, if you've like talked to ChatGPT or used an image generation prompt like AI thing, like ultimately the good content that comes out of that is going to come from people who are already good writers and can make it, like, use it as a plus up to like generate more funny ideas about restaurant names that have burrito in the title or whatever the like very specific thing is. Whereas an average player is going to sit down at something like a ChatGPT or an AI generated game and think, okay, I want to see Batman. Cool, there's Batman. There he is. I did it. Like, and they're going to have like a kind of sour experience because they're like, players aren't necessarily willing to be that creative. They like more the I hit a guy with a shovel and Indiana Jones said something about shovels. They think that's more like it connects better in our brains. That said, like, you know, we're still making games in Source 2. We will make more single player games over the years, and I hope that they are the thing that you want. And they're hopefully more of the thing that I want as well. So we will, you know, talk more about that someday.
Thank you.
Yep.
More questions? Yes, Kate. So please be quiet because it's a bit far, and speak loud.
Thank you for the presentation. And I would like to ask you, what do you think in VR games would be the best way to deal with different player behaviors through dialogue scenes? For example, I remember that early during my playthrough of Half-Life Alyx, I remember being so impressed by the mechanics with the gravity gloves that I wasn't really paying attention to the dialogue that Russell. And
yes.
Polygon, I was like playing with the head crabs or like on the ceiling, just like messing with them instead of paying attention to what the character itself was saying.
Yes, this is sort of related to what I was talking about a minute ago, where you start to fill your game with so much density that players are now, they just like the toy that's in front of them. I mean, part of the thing with a game like Half-Life Alyx is when we play tested, like, and we play tested a lot, especially the early parts of that game, to try and reach the level of like interesting fidelity that we could get to. But, you know, like 3 minutes into that video game, you are walking around in VR and you can pick up a marker and start writing on the walls, and then you realize, oh my God, I'm in a world that I can do all the things that a human can do. So why would I pay attention to what these characters are talking about? Like something with a teleporter or a train? I don't care. Like I want to pick up the bullets and juggle them, like or whatever, is more interesting. I mean, part of that is we like the idea, and in an era like, I don't know, we're 15 years into Twitch streaming existing, so a Twitch streamer, for example, when they play a video game, they are acting. They're like doing performance art on top of the video game. They want a video game where they can sort of do a thing and then they can react. They can say, "Chat, is this real?" You know, all that sort of things. We like to design video games so that someone who is playing it can be having that sort of conversation in their own head, or if they are actually streaming it on Twitch, they can be having that conversation with their audience. But you know, we don't build them specifically. Like a VR game on Twitch is actually not very interesting, but like the design space that exists in, where you are able to be an actor in a scene and react, is interesting. I mean, what you're talking about, where specifically you're messing around with the gravity gloves and not paying attention to the conversation, I mean, that's true in Half-Life 2, which is 20 years, like I said, 20 years old at this point. There's a scene in Kleiner's lab early in that game where they're explaining a lot about the world state, and most players are picking up bottles and throwing them at people's faces, or they are messing with the computers, or just doing all sorts of things. And, you know, maybe on a second playthrough you'll behave and actually watch the story. But we find that like building a game where you have that opportunity is more memorable to the players than just forcing them through the story. So if you're watching like a Halo playthrough, a Halo 2 or something, and the characters are just like talking on and on about the Revenant and the Covenant and the Earth orbit things, you'd start to just space out. And I'd prefer that if you're spacing out that you're at least juggling cans. So that's my take on that. Now that said, for ideal interaction in VR, I don't know. The VR is like an interesting experiment. It's an interesting technology. It will come and go over the decades. Eventually, we will solve like all of the health concerns that prevent it from being, you know, a comfortable experience for everyone. And it will probably be the way that people experience media, because planting screens all over our houses or carrying them around is going to eventually probably be weird. But yeah, we'll see.
Thank you. More questions? No questions? Are you shy? Oh, there's one question there.
So thank you for the presentation again. Say you just finished writing dialogues, things like that, for any kind of media. How are you sure the dialogues are good per se, or that they translate what you are trying to say to the person reading or watching or playing?
I missed some of those words. I'm sorry. Can you repeat some of that, Annabella?
I would say, let's say you finished writing dialogue for a movie or a game or a book.
Mm-hmm.
How are you sure that the dialogues are good enough for the person watching to understand?
Yeah, that is like that gets into like, how is your writing quality? How do you know you're done? And like this is like, there are lots of versions of done. Sometimes done means we have released our thing on time. Sometimes it means we've made the hard choice of, we internally played through it, we've had a serious discussion, we think this part is a little dry, this part is not good. For example, I mentioned in Half-Life Alyx, we went through this like kind of painful experience about a year and a half before that game was done, and decided none of the writing was useful. Like it was just, we need to rewrite this whole thing. How do you know that it's good is like, you need to, I mean, in a small scale, you need to find someone in your life who will be honest with you and sometimes rude. I find that art students tend to be better at this than most other things. Art students are more used to having work critiqued in a way that is not judgmental of them, the person, so they are also useful for giving that sort of feedback. I find that like friends are sometimes not the best people at giving feedback, but you can become friends with someone who gives you good feedback. I don't know if that is a useful metric. I think that like when I talked about playtesting earlier, that in a video game especially, that is extremely it. Like you can watch someone reacting to your writing in real time and ask them later, what do you remember? Who was the characters? What did they say? Like some very simple questions. And if they don't know any of it, then you're not telling them enough. You're not being clear enough, at least. That doesn't necessarily tell you quality, but it does tell you, have you like hit a base level target of understanding from your audience? But if they have positive things to say, like, hey, I really like this character, they're very funny. We talked about Half-Life Alyx a minute ago. There's a character in that named Russell, voiced by this guy, Reese Darby, who's a comedian, and we wrote a lot of funny things for him to say. And people liked the funny things that he said, the ones who weren't busy juggling cans or whatever. But they, I think that stuff just sort of shakes out over like getting a lot of feedback. It can also be one of the hardest things with writing, I find, is being able to realize that what you've made isn't good, and that is extremely like knowing that you need to undo the thing that you've written. Being able to I don't know, what was the kill the baby or something? Like there's some horrible phrase that you can use for writing for this that's like knowing that what you've done isn't good enough and you need to do it again. It can be hard to come to that realization on your own. Sometimes you need to have other people continually give you the feedback. Like you need multiple people to tell you that they don't like a thing in order for you to actually really truly understand that it's not good enough. But I talked a bit in my talk here about like a writer's room environment. And what a writer's room is sometimes you're just floating an idea. Like, hey, what if like, you know, you could drive the car? Or what if this character showed up and said something about, I don't know, hamburgers? And if other people in the room were like, you know what, that's actually kind of interesting. Or if everybody just ignores it, that's probably not a great idea. Like there are simple fixes for this that you find professionally, at least, where you can surround yourself with creative people who will like plus up ideas or sort of help you shoot down bad ones early. But to know when you're done, I mean, often, certainly in the case of a young person's life, knowing when you're done is like, when can I release this? When I've reached minimum viable product or whatever on this, so that somebody else can read it, and then I can learn from that, and then I can make another thing. If you're trying to write your life's great opus, sometimes that can mean, well, we need to spend 5 more years on this to come up with the right ideas, and that is like a huge band of possibilities. I don't know. But again, maybe find someone in your life who will give you honest feedback and is willing to be a bit rude, and that is like the key.
Thank you. So we are approaching the 30 minutes past 6. Do you want a last question, maybe, to wrap it up? Yeah. Love.
So, first of all, again, thank you very much for the presentation. And my question is, we've talked about these issues during or at the end of narrative to know if it's good enough. But my question comes with methodology and organization. If we're starting a narrative and if we're writing or starting to write something, what kind of approach do you suggest that we take?
So this starts to get into like screenwriting techniques. How do you draw people into your world, and how do you do enough of that so that they care once you start asking them to do things in a video game, I think is like kind of the heart of what you're getting at. Like how much I don't know how much story is enough or something is sort of kind of what you're getting at. I think studying, like that's when I talk about like reading screenplays, reading books, especially for movies that you liked or things, because screenplays are really quick. Like you can read a screenplay for a movie that you liked in like 25 minutes, and most of them are online. And they tend to give you a good feeling of like, oh, you know, if you watch, I don't know, Inception, which is a movie with, I will say big ideas. I don't want to get into analysis of Inception, but like it has a pretty hard idea for a normal audience to understand. It starts with an unrelated scene in the beginning to sort of unsettle the audience and gives them enough like, oh, this movie is going to be kind of weird, and then it cuts, and the next scene is I'm explaining what just happened in that sequence. I think that like that's kind of a really good example of how much, I don't know, writing to put into the opening of your game in order to draw people in. I don't know. I don't have a great metric for this.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's well, let's finish because I think Ben, you still have a day of work ahead of you.
I do. I got to go to the office now.
Okay, so thank you very much, Ben. Once again, you said something about sharing the presentation. Then
yeah, I'll email you a link to the PowerPoint.
Yeah, so I will share with them because there was a few links that maybe they can take a look, and also me as well. I'm quite interested as well. So thank you so much once again, and thank you also for coming. It was a pleasure to have you here, and well, until next time. Or maybe you want also to have a question or something. Then I didn't ask you if you want to ask us something, but feel free.
No,
you're
I was gonna ask. So whenever I talk to universities, I like to ask what their like sports mascots are, but I don't think your school has sports teams, which is not useful. I'm not a sports fan. I just like that as a conversation point. I saw that you're like burgundy and blue, I think. Burgundy and white are your school colors, something like that. But that's the most I could find. Anyway, it was nice talking to everybody. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you.
Yay. All right. Goodbye.